In the winter of 1889, a horologist named Frederick Anselm was dispatched by the Royal Observatory in Greenwich to examine a tower clock in the municipal building of a small city called Harbridge in the English Midlands that had been running continuously since its installation in 1791, 98 years, without a documented winding record. Anselm was not sent because the clock was unusual. He was sent because a local alderman had written to the observatory asking, in the language of a man who expected a simple answer, why the clock in their town hall had not needed winding in living memory and whether this was normal. Anselm arrived on a Tuesday in February. He spent 3 days. He examined the clock movement, a standard long-case escapement, weight-driven, the kind fitted into hundreds of English public buildings in the late 18th century. A weight-driven clock requires its weights to be wound by hand on a regular cycle. The Harbridge clock's weights were still in their original positions. The drum on which the winding chain coiled had not moved. Anselm measured the chain tension. He examined the arbors for evidence of resetting. He looked for a secondary movement that might explain a perpetual drive. He found nothing that should have been keeping that clock running for 98 years. He wrote a report of 12 pages. He submitted it to the observatory. The report described, in technical language that left no room for equivocation, a clock that was operating without a functioning power source. In the report's final paragraph, Anselm wrote that he could offer no mechanical explanation for the clock's continued operation and that the matter warranted further investigation by a specialist in electromagnetic phenomena, a field that was, in 1889, in its earliest years of practical development. Anselm's report was received by the observatory. It was assigned a reference number. It does not appear in any published catalogue of observatory correspondence for the period. The Harbridge town clock ran for another 11 years. In 1900, during a renovation of the municipal building, it was removed. No record was made of where it went. The official history of horology, the study and craft of timekeeping, acknowledges one class of clock that operates without conventional winding, the atmospheric clock, sometimes called the barometric clock, which draws its energy from fluctuations in air pressure and temperature. The most famous example is the Beverley clock at the University of Otago in New Zealand, which has run almost continuously since 1864 and is cited regularly as a demonstration of atmospheric drive mechanisms. The atmospheric clock is real. Its mechanism is understood. It is taught in horological courses and displayed in museum collections. And it is nothing like what Frederick Anselm found in Harbridge. An atmospheric clock requires a specific sealed chamber mechanism to capture pressure differentials. It has identifiable moving parts driven by that capture. It has a documented maintenance history of adjustments to its atmospheric intake. The Harbridge clock was a standard, weight-driven long-case movement. It had no atmospheric mechanism. It had no sealed chamber. It had no intake. It had weights that had not moved in 98 years and a pendulum that was swinging. Anselm knew the difference. He had spent 22 years examining English public clocks for the observatory. He had seen atmospheric mechanisms. He knew what they looked like. He wrote 12 pages specifically because what he found was not one. Before we go further, if these buried investigations are something you want more of, hit subscribe so the next one reaches you when it drops. The algorithm tends to bury this kind of research unless you tell it you want it. To understand why the Harbridge clock matters and why it was not the only one, you have to understand what was being built into public structures across England, Europe, and the northeastern United States during the period between roughly 1780 and 1850. That period is the one in which the great municipal clocks appeared: tower clocks, church clocks, courthouse clocks, exchange building clocks. These were not merely timekeeping instruments in the decorative sense. They were civic infrastructure, the standard by which an entire community coordinated its daily life, its commerce, its labor schedules, its social rhythms. The institutions that commissioned them, city councils, church authorities, trading companies, paid substantial sums for their installation and expected them to function reliably for generations. What they did not always specify, and what the contractors who installed certain of these clocks did not always explain to their clients, was what exactly was powering them. The weight-driven mechanism was the standard answer given, and it was verifiable to anyone who looked at the movement. You could see the weights, you could see the drum, you could see where the winding key engaged. The answer satisfied most commissioners. But the commissioners were administrators and civic officials, not engineers. They knew what a clock was supposed to look like. They did not always know what they were looking at, and in a small but specific number of documented cases that share particular architectural features and a particular installation period, the clock on the tower was connected to something other than a wound weight. The mechanism was concealed inside the masonry. The connection ran downward rather than outward, and the craftsmen who built it had a term for what they had built, which they used between themselves in their ledgers and their correspondence, but did not explain to the councils who paid them, because the explanation would have raised questions that those craftsmen, for reasons that the surviving record does not make entirely clear, preferred not to be asked. A clockmaker named Jonas Heth operated a workshop in Philadelphia from 1812 to 1848. He installed public clocks in 6 buildings across Pennsylvania and 1 in New Jersey. His workshop records, a set of leather-bound ledgers, 5 volumes covering the full span of his career, donated to the Library Company of Philadelphia by his grandson in 1903, are still accessible there today. The ledgers contained standard business records, materials costs, labor charges, customer correspondence, maintenance schedules, notes on movement adjustments. A working record of a competent craftsman's professional life across 36 years. But in 3 entries spread across the 1820s and 1830s, Heth uses a phrase that his grandson, in a handwritten note inserted at the front of the first ledger when he donated them, specifically flagged as unusual and unexplained. The phrase is connected to the ground line. It appears in the installation notes for 3 of Heth's 7 public clock commissions, each time listed as a completed task alongside the standard installation steps: movement fitted, weights hung, pendulum regulated, clock connected to the ground line. His grandson's note reads in full, "I have spent some years attempting to determine what this phrase means in the context of a clock installation. I have consulted 2 practicing clockmakers and 1 professor of mechanical sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. None has been able to explain it to my satisfaction. I include the ledgers in their entirety in case a future reader may know what my grandfather meant." No future reader, in more than 120 years of the ledger's accessibility at the Library Company, has published any account of what it means. The 3 clocks for which Heth recorded a ground line connection were the 3 that, according to his maintenance records, required no winding visits in the 10-year periods following their installation. The 4 clocks without the notation required regular winding on the standard schedule. The distinction is precise. It is in his own handwriting. It is not ambiguous. This is where Anselm's 12 pages and Heth's ledger notation converge on a third document, one that was not written by a horologist or a clockmaker, but by an electrical engineer, and that was not written in England or America, but in Prague in 1901. A Czech engineer named Alois Dvořák submitted a paper to the Bohemian Society of Engineers in October 1901 titled On the Anomalous Continuance of Mechanical Motion in Certain Older Tower Clocks. The paper was 34 pages. It described 7 specific tower clocks in the Bohemian region, all of them installed between 1790 and 1840, that shared the same characteristic Anselm had documented in Harbridge: continuous operation without a winding record consistent with a conventional weight-driven mechanism. De Vogt had examined all 7 clocks personally. He had measured their movements. He had interviewed local custodians. And he had found, in 4 of the 7, a feature that Anselm had not reported, or had not known to look for. In each of the 4, running from the base of the clock tower down through the building's foundation and into the ground, was a copper rod, not a lightning conductor, which would have been attached to the exterior of the building and grounded at the surface. A copper rod sealed inside the foundation masonry, running to a depth that De Vogt could not determine from above, but estimated, based on the masonry he could examine, at no less than 12 feet. The paper's conclusion was careful. De Vogt did not claim to understand the mechanism by which a grounded copper rod could sustain a clock movement. He claimed only that the 4 clocks with the rods shared the anomalous operating history, and the 3 without the rods did not, and that this correlation warranted systematic investigation. The paper was accepted by the Society, assigned to a review committee, and tabled. It remained tabled until the Society dissolved in 1938. The paper was never published in any journal. A copy is in the technical archive of what is now the Czech Technical University in Prague, where it was transferred after the Society's dissolution. It was catalogued in 1947. No published work in horology or electrical history has cited it. But here is what makes De Vogt's copper rods the most significant detail in this entire account. In 1899, 2 years before De Vogt submitted his paper, a patent application was filed in Vienna by an inventor named Karl Brenner for a device he described as a terrestrial current collector for mechanical drive systems. Brenner's application described, in technical language, a system in which a copper conductor running to sufficient depth in the earth could draw a continuous low-level electrical current from the ground itself, what would now be called telluric current, the natural electrical potential that exists between different depths of the Earth's crust. Brenner claimed this current, properly conducted and regulated, was sufficient to maintain the escapement motion of a mechanical clock without any additional power source. His patent application was reviewed. It was not granted. The examiner's decision cited prior art, which would indicate that a similar claim had already been filed or documented. The prior art cited in the examiner's decision was sealed, meaning it was classified as confidential. It has remained sealed. Brenner's application itself is in the Austrian Patent Archive in Vienna. The sealed prior art citation is noted in the decision. The citation's contents have never been made available. Strasbourg, 1843. The great astronomical clock in the Strasbourg Cathedral is reinstalled after a decades-long restoration. The restoration team's records, filed with the cathedral chapter, note that during the dismantling of the original 1574 clock, workers found a copper element embedded in the clock tower's masonry that was not part of the clock movement, and whose function no member of the restoration team could identify. The element was removed, catalogued as architectural ironwork, and not reinstalled. The restored clock was fitted with a conventional winding mechanism. It has required winding on the standard schedule ever since. Frankfurt, 1856. A municipal clockmaker named Ernst Waldbach, hired to service the tower clock in the old Ermer City Hall, reports to the city council that the clock's weight drum shows no evidence of having been wound in a period he estimates at not less than 40 years. The council instructs him to service the clock and make no further report on the winding question. He complies. He notes the instruction in his own workshop diary, which his family retains. The diary is in a private collection in Frankfurt and has not been digitized. Boston, 1878. A workman repointing masonry in the tower of the Old South Meeting House discovers a corroded copper rod running vertically through the interior of a foundation wall. He reports it to the building supervisor. The supervisor instructs him to continue the repointing work around it and make no notation in the work log. The workman mentions it to his brother in a letter dated March 14, 1878. The letter is in a collection of family papers held at the Massachusetts Historical Society. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. The British Horological Institute has never adequately explained why the 12-page report filed by Frederick Anselm with the Royal Observatory in 1889, a report by a 22-year veteran examiner describing a clock operating without a functional power source, does not appear in any published index of observatory correspondence for the period. Despite bearing an assigned reference number that confirms it was received and logged, it is never explained why Devox's 1901 paper, accepted by a professional engineering society and assigned to a review committee, remained tabled for the entire 37 years of that society's subsequent existence, and has received no citation in any published work on horology or electrical history in the 123 years since its submission. It is never explained why Carl Brenner's 1899 patent application for a terrestrial current collector for mechanical drive systems was denied on grounds of prior art, meaning someone had already documented this idea, while the prior art cited in that denial was simultaneously sealed as confidential, making it impossible to determine what was known, by whom, and when. Why would a city council instruct a clockmaker to make no further report on a clock that had not been wound in 40 years, if the explanation were simple and the question posed no inconvenience? Why would a restoration team remove a copper element from the masonry of a clock tower, note that its function was unknown, catalog it as architectural ironwork, and not reinstall it? Rather than consulting the astronomical engineer overseeing the restoration, whose professional domain such an element would directly concern? Why would the examiner of a patent application for a device claiming to extract power from the earth classify the prior art supporting his denial rather than cite it openly, unless what that prior art revealed was something that official record-keeping needed to keep out of public view? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty what the ground line in Jonas Heth's ledger connected to, or what ran through the copper rods in the foundations of Devox's 7 Bohemian towers. What we know is that telluric current, the low-level natural electrical potential moving through the Earth's crust at all times, is a documented and measurable phenomenon. What we know is that the technology required to draw it through a copper conductor and use it to maintain a mechanical escapement is not complex. What we know is that the clocks which had that connection ran without winding, and the clocks that did not required it on schedule, and that the people who installed the connection had a name for it, ground line, and chose not to explain it in documents that anyone else would read. And we know that when an electrical engineer in Prague finally put the observation on paper and submitted it to a professional body in 1901, the professional body tabled the paper, and the paper remained tabled until the society was dissolved, and the paper sat in a university archive for 76 years without a single published citation. Frederick Anselm retired from the Royal Observatory in 1897, 8 years after his trip to Harbridge. His 12 pages went with the reference number into whatever part of the observatory's archive those reference numbers led to. He did not, So far as any surviving record shows, write about the Harbridge clock again. He did not pursue Dvoke's line of inquiry before it was written. He submitted his 12 pages, received no response, and returned to his ordinary work of examining ordinary clocks that ran on weights and springs and required winding on the schedule their makers specified. Whether he spent the remaining years of his career thinking about the clock in Harbridge, the pendulum swinging in a mechanism whose weights had not moved in 98 years, the record does not say. The Harbridge clock was removed in 1900. No record was made of where it went. If it still exists, in an estate sale lot, in a private collection, in a storeroom somewhere in the English Midlands, the copper rod running into what would have been its base connection point would still be there. Corroded now. 98 years of continuous operation, and then cut off, sometime in 1900, and set aside. The pendulum stopped. The weights, still in their original position, still unwound, finally at rest. The official history of horology tells us that clocks run because weights descend or springs uncoil or atmospheric differentials drive sealed mechanisms. What Heth's ledger, Anselm's report, Dvoke's paper, and the copper rod in a Boston Foundation wall tell us is that some clocks, a specific, identifiable, documentable subset of public clocks installed during a specific window of time, ran because they were connected to something in the ground that the people who built them understood and the institutions that followed them preferred not to investigate. Subscribe and share this with someone who still asks why certain things worked in ways we are no longer told about. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when the last person who knew what connected to what takes that knowledge with him. Next week, I am following the sealed prior art from Brenner's 1899 Viennese patent denial, following the reference number through the Austrian Imperial Archive to a document filed in 1847 by an engineer whose name appears in connection with the installation of no fewer than 6 tower clocks in Central Europe during that decade. An engineer named Heinrich Voss. One notebook, never published. You will not want to miss it.